You know, while everything is growing so fast, people start showing up at our church. Pastors around the country just start showing up.
And when God's growing Real Life and we're going through all this growth and all these things were happening, a couple things happened. Articles came out in national magazines and
Outreach magazine. I don't know how in the world they got our information. They just would print stuff. They didn't even want an interview. They just would list our names in it. Christian Standard, we were Church of the Decade. We didn't even know we were in the running.
I get a call from a publisher who says, hey, do you guys have anything you've written? And we would like to take your story to the nation because it's very unusual in a small area.
It was because we were growing so fast in an area that we shouldn't have been, and they wanted to know what was going on.
Do me a favor, would you just pray with me? I'm gonna ask the Holy Spirit to give me the words to say, and I'm gonna ask you to say to the Lord today.
Jim was getting asked to speak at conferences, and there's a couple little quick stories that kind of give an example of what was happening, right? Jim got invited to speak for the first time at the North American Christian Conference. So Lance and I go with Jim, we fly there. We get delayed through flights and all this. We show up, we almost miss it. Jim's got to speak on stage for the first time. There's like the room 500-600 pastors, and Jim gets on stage, and Lance and I are sitting in the front row. And Jim kind of tells the real life story, but he's talking about making disciples. Jim's being Jim, and he's hammering these guys on the truth of Scripture, what the church is supposed to be, and it was excellent, and it was hard, and it was good, and Jim's doing his thing. And he gets to the end, this big moment. And Jim's like, yeah, so that's what you all need to go do. And if you have any questions, my guys are right here in the front. Come ask Brandon Ginnan. If you want to know about small groups, come ask Brandon and Lance. And he and here's my guys. And he walks off the stage. And I remember turning around and there was a line of people that wanted to ask us our story and ask us about how to actually go do this. And I was so overwhelmed, we'd only been doing this, that was probably in 2003. So we're at this for 4 years. Didn't remember me? I didn't grow up in church. This is new. Hey, Jim, just 4 years before, pushed me a stack of books and go read it. Right. To understand how early this was and what God was teaching us was crazy.
We had audience with big churches that were doing it in a different direction. And we had a mega church in the middle of nowhere in comparison to Phoenix or other populated areas. There was nobody out here in North Idaho, at least from their perspective. And all of a sudden we had a big church, a really big church. And so they wanted to know what was going on. And all of a sudden we were able to talk about discipleship at a national level. And for a period of time, it became the major topic of conversation between churches is what is discipleship essentially, and is this something we should do?
And so I started getting phone calls every week. Lance got calls, all the guys, everybody, people were reaching out to go, hey, could we come learn?
Now all these people are coming around the country, and so we got together and we put together a manual for what we believed about these things, about how to develop elders and how to raise up staff and how to do discipleship. And this manual gets put into a book called Church as a Team Sport, and it's published. We kind of put that together so that we would have something to hand out for people to read versus taking up all of our time, because again, we're primarily a local church that's trying to minister to our people. Well, after a while, they just keep coming. Now that what we're passing out is getting passed around.
And there was just this really neat season that started then that was kind of parallel with Real Life, was the voice that God had given this place to speak in, and a voice of encouragement, a voice of, we believed very early on to give it away. Well, this isn't ours anyway. And so we started having churches show up here, and we started doing different trainings, and we were going other places, and it turned into this huge thing. There was not a week, hardly a day that went by that I didn't have an email or a phone call from some church somewhere in the country wanting to know how did you build that small group system? What curriculum are you using? How did you? And so it was insane. So with all these churches reaching out, we were like, what are we going to do? We've got to put some kind of system together to do this, because it was eating up everybody's time and it was unorganized. And
we decide we're going to start doing a training one time a month to force all the people that are kind of coming off and on to come to one time in one place.
We had something called a care conference. Then we had something that transitioned into a conference called Immersion. And then when Jim wrote the book Discipleship, we kind of adjusted that training and then started calling it Discipleship.
The heart then is the same it is today, was to help a church make a transition to being a disciple-making church, to learn and apply these biblical principles. And so we started writing and putting that all into this kind of condensed material that we would walk them through. And we were doing that in small groups so they could not only look at the content, but also experience what we were talking about. And so we had people coming here, and that just grew and grew, the demand. And it continued to grow to where we were working with well over 1,000 leaders a year through that, and churches from all over. I was doing immersion trainings in foreign countries with leaders, and so it went nuts.
Our goal was not to gather a crowd, as we've said, but to raise up leaders. And so what are the things that we think these leaders need to know, and how do we train them to do that with regular everyday people?
I don't have a Bible degree. I didn't go to Bible college. And in my head, I constantly thought in those days, but I was a single mom with 2 kids from Montana. I don't know how God could possibly utilize me to be able to help people learn about discipleship. And so it was very intimidating, but I had people around me, and my husband included, just very much encouraging me to continue doing it.
These pastors would come and sit and listen to our presentation and our little mini conference, and afterwards I love talking to them about, what did they get? And one of the things that often people do is they make excuses. They're like, well, we couldn't do what you guys are doing because you have such good leaders. When they would say things like that, I would say, these guys that are leading this group all came from here. People just don't want to spend time turning them into diamonds. They want the diamonds already. And as disciple makers, we know it starts at the very beginning. Somebody gets saved and they're incorporated into a family. They get to grow up and see what it means to be a contributor in that family, and they have gifts and abilities that they recognize and are trained in, and then they get to be spiritual parents, coaches of others, and it just starts a movement that is spread throughout Kootenai County, the region, and now even the nation, and even around the world.
I remember one time we went to Boise Bible College, and we did a discipleship there. And I didn't know who my group was going to be, and they put me with all the professors. And I do remember crying. I was so mad at the person that put me there. I was like, what are you doing? And I was terrified. And here I'm sitting there with all these gentlemen that are professors, and it was just overwhelming. What it ended up coming down to at the very last day was the relationship side of it. Was we shared our story of when we talked about the prodigal son. I shared my story of my daughter who struggled with drugs and addiction, and how I identified with the father. Sitting there watching these men cry, and they're like, wait, we have never heard the story told like that before. And I remember at the end, at the debrief, one of the guys just weeping, and he said, I've never heard anyone relate to a Bible story like that before. And he's like, that was life-changing for me. We've all worked together for years and we don't know each other. And so I realized then, like, God will use me in a more relational way instead of just this transfer of biblical knowledge to relate to people. So for me, I can connect relationally with people, and that was how I started connecting with people more.
The thing that we struggled so much early on with alignment and with unity was the very thing that we were seeing these churches walk in the door that they were completely missing. Like, they didn't have one definition that would even stack up with one another. And so the early stages that God had us go through, wrestling through that stuff, I think was really important for us to communicate at a heart level what Jesus really wants his church to know. And for us, it was like, if we can't live this out ourselves, and if we just gonna package this and put our little stamp on it, and we have no idea how to stay aligned ourselves, and how in the world are we gonna have any credit with other people, in God's eyes anyway?
Well, it's been 25 years now, and people always ask, all right, how do you manage all this growth but still keep the main thing the main thing? And my answer is, we struggle with that. We don't always.
When an organization grows as fast as Real Life does, it's no one's fault, but there are some immense challenges of taking care of your own people.
No one woke up one morning and said, we want to be a mega church. Just, that was not the case. It just, God decided to do what he did, and which is very indicative of, I mean, if we look at Pentecost and the church grew at Pentecost, there's some significant numbers there. It's like chaos overnight, right? And we got to experience that, and all it did ultimately was drive us back to Jesus, you know, and I think we've not been perfect. We've not been perfect.
It's a learning process, it's a growing process, and there are some very, very hard things to go through. Relational issues between you and your up team because you feel like you're not being taken care of. And they're the same way. They're doing everything, pouring out everything they can, and they just can't keep up. So if you're not careful, the devil's whispering in your ear saying, they really don't care about you. Or, yep, they've just kind of left you on your own. And so guarding your heart, guarding your mind, keeping conversations open, making sure we're talking through this and not giving the devil a foothold, because that's the very thing. Jim was always saying this. Real easy to identify the problems coming from without, but the devil wants to take you down from within. So a house divided against itself will fall. And boy, you're running as hard and strong as Real Life was, and in some instances still is, but in different ways. But that's a big learning curve, and it poses a lot of challenges.
My role in time as executive pastor, when I really look back on it, was absolutely to lead our executive team, to care for the guys that were, in the trenches with our staff. But I think a part of it was to really help hold to who we were. And I think we had grown so much, and we were going through this season of trying to really get clear on who we were, with all of that growth, where were there holes in what we were doing, and in hindsight and looking back at what were things we needed to shore up.
So I started out as the sports and outdoors pastor. I was in that role, I think it was about 10 months. And then kind of at the end of that time, we were at kind of the peak season of Real Life's growth. In fact, one of the, probably I think it was month 2 when I was here, I remember coming in to church one day and Brandon said, the church grew 1,000 people from last week. They put 2 or 3 different ministries under my supervision, where I still had sports and outdoors directly for a little bit, and then had kind of supervisory oversight of a couple other ministries. I kind of to get my foot wet in leadership at that level, which is a complete different dynamic than just leading a ministry in and of itself. And that went well. And so it was only a few months after that Brandon had invited me onto the executive team to be one of the executive pastors on the team. When the church had grown to the size it was, both in people attending, size of the staff, budgets that you have to navigate, all of that, there was organizational complexities that were kind of at a critical state, honestly. It was a really challenging time. And so I would say there was a few years there that were interesting for a variety of reasons. One is when you have a visionary senior pastor as dynamic and visionary as Jim, slowing down to do some housekeeping is not part of his DNA, which is why we love Jim as our senior pastor, and also part of why it made it a really difficult season. Because you'll hear Jim talk a lot about taking ground. It doesn't feel like you're taking ground when you're cleaning up your house. You're just surviving kind of type thing. And so we all collectively had a passion and vision to be able to take ground, but also recognize that organizationally, we're actually not in a spot right now that we're healthy enough to be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to sustain taking ground at this point. And so we had a few years where we had to be a little bit more introspective than kind of vision taking ground outwardly, and our prayer and hope is that we were going to steward that responsibility in the way that is actually taking ground. We're just not seeing yet, right? It's tilling the soil for that which can be even greater than what could be otherwise if we just continue to push forward. But it was challenging. The byproduct of how we had led had resulted in a culture of a staff that was really unhealthy. We hadn't shepherded well. We were hearing things like, herky-jerky leadership, and that was never certainly anybody's heart to have that be the experience of people on our team. We knew that if we were going to be able to move forward, having a healthy team to do that with was critical, and so we took kind of a risky step, but a needed step, and we asked our staff anonymously to all share one word of how they would describe what it was like to be on staff at Real Life. And if you want to be humbled as a leader, do that at that time, because the feedback, it was not good. It was really hard to see what it felt like to be on the other end of our leadership, knowing that, man, we're praying and trying the best to do the best that we can. But the reality is, at the end of that, it's not going well. People are getting hurt, and it's not a positive experience for all of the things that we've talked about of how much we care about people and their families. That's not what was being realized at the time as kind of a byproduct of all of this.
Like, how in the world are we ever going to have God's favor if we can't even play together and align together relationally? If the whole gospel message is about relationship and we hate each other, then there's something drastically wrong here, right? And so early on, that's what we were experiencing. And then that even fueled our passion and our drive even more to be more clear and to change or to adjust our language so that that language scaled out away from here. Because the vision statement that God gave us to reach the world for Jesus, one person at a time, it's too large for any one person. I love it because none of us can do it unless we're interdependent on one another, but more importantly, dependent on God. We need Jesus to lead this, right?
So we really had to kind of rewind from some of the forward-taking vision and go, we need to address and really learn where is our staff at, be humble enough to hear hard things, and hopefully courageous enough to then take steps to change.
I know that I have some characteristics that were helpful to the process, but I also have some characteristics that were harmful to the process. And so I'm grateful that God brought people into my life that were strong enough to stand up to me and face me down about the areas that I was wrong in. The people that God has brought around me that are committed and they stay in there and they fight through with me has helped me to be less of me in the areas I needed to be less in, and more of me in the areas I needed to be more in.
And I've watched him raise up men as elders who, I think people think he's the key dog in this place, but those elders will tell him no. Jim will blast off like Mount Vesuvius, and they'll just let him go. And then before it's done, one of them will say, okay, Jim, but we're not gonna do that. And I watched biblical elders function and watch these guys mature and watch them bring in new people. Just one by one, God has brought people here not to say, yay, Jim, but to be a part of the team and to learn together and to pick each other up when they fail. It's a blessing.
We've grown now to 8,000 people. So we decided it was time to, build the other half of the building. When we had built our biggest building here, RLM1, it was in the long-term plan, we were gonna just, build the other half of it and go to a 3,500 seat auditorium. But before we did that, we decided we'd take some guys around the country and look at some of these buildings and look at our facilities and our property and try to decide whether what we were gonna do was the right thing to do. And we just wanted to get as much wisdom as we could before we went ahead and moved forward. So we went around the country, and one of the things that we noticed for places that had that big of an auditorium, the parking looked completely different. The access to the property was different. We had very little access, and it was a very long and narrow piece of property. And so our guys are there looking at a building, I think it was in Dallas at the airport, and I took a little nap. I was super tired because we'd been traveling, and I wake up and the guys are over there, all of our elders are over there, and they're talking, and I come over and they said, hey, Jim, maybe rather than building on this property, we should sell what we have and move to a place that has better access and not so narrow and kind of out of town a little bit more, because the town was growing up around our property. And I was like, no way. We have gone through building projects. We had done all this planning. And the guys said, hey, Jim, we agree if God doesn't want us to do this, then we shouldn't. But let's just pray about it for a couple of days. Let's fast and pray, and let's see what God would do, and give him a chance. Let's just slow down and give him a chance to change our mind about this. And so I said, okay, what are we asking for? And they said, one of the guys said, well, let's just ask him to do something that's super obvious, like 100 acres near town for a couple $1 million. And I go, so you're asking for us to pray about something and it to be like some sort of miracle thing. And I was like, okay, that's great. That makes it easy. We'll make it hard on God and easy on us. And so I went back, we flew back to town. The next day I get a phone call from a guy, and he's a friend, and he's been coming to our church for quite a while. And he says, hey, Jim, I want to meet you for coffee. So I go to coffee with him, and he says, hey, I've been thinking about giving property for a really good deal to Real Life Ministries. And as soon as he said that, I was like, well, okay, well, how much property? He said, it's like 118 acres. I said, where is it? And he told me, and it was like dead center of Kootenai County, not that far from where we are. And it had all the things that the guys had talked about. And I go, well, how much are you planning on, giving this to us for? And he said, I would give you a really good deal, maybe $2 million. And he actually named the price that the elders had talked about in the airport for more than 100 acres. It was 118 acres. And it shook me up. And so I called the elders and we had a meeting. We said, okay, we need to really pray about this. And we would have already started on the building project expanding if this hadn't happened. So again, we stopped and we bought the 118 acres, We told the church we were going to be moving. We brought in architects. We did all this stuff. And of course, this takes time. And little did we know that in 2008, the housing crisis hit and everything went down around us. And at the same time, we were getting the architectural plans and everything it would cost and everything that it was going to take with this 118 acres. And the price was more than we could pay. We found out in 2008 what it was going to be. The crisis hits, the entire area is hit hard. And so at that point, we said, you know what? We can't afford to move at this point. And rather than us do this, we're going to go back to the old project. But then because of the 2008, we said we're going to have to put that off. And so at the time, I was shaken by this because I felt like God had said this. I've said for many years, I'm not a prophet. We pray about things. We look to see what God is doing next. And then if we feel like this is a God thing consistent with Scripture and it's obvious, we move forward. Well, this was the first time we actually had something like this happen where we moved forward and then every door was shut.
It felt like there for years, for the first 3-4 years, that whatever we did, we would expect a particular, like, okay, this should solve the problem and this should be good. The results were unbelievably great. Whatever we tried to seem like it was turning into diamonds. I mean, it felt like we had the Midas touch there for so long. We were on such a trajectory, it didn't feel like we had any losses. We didn't know why we were winning was the issue. And we didn't know why we were winning until we tried to go out to the property.
And so that shook us up. Now, what we did at that point is I got back up on the stage in front of all the people and said, guys, I told you I wasn't a prophet. Here's what's happened. We're willing to give you back the money that you gave. We had done a campaign for money to buy the property. We're willing to give you back the money, but we're not going to go forward with this project with what just happened in the housing market and where we're at. But we also knew that we couldn't stop growing and reaching people. We were reaching people from wherever. And remember, our goal at the time was we're gonna reach the world, and we were reaching people through our books and our resources. This place was exploding. But we also believed in raising up leaders, and we had raised up a ton of leaders on staff. But at that point, we thought, you know what? Rather than us build a bigger building here, which was going to be so expensive, and with all the economy issues, maybe what God is leading us to is raising up church planners. We
finally got our noses clipped, and it was because God was trying to show us, I don't want you to get continually bigger. I want you to break up more and more and just do the same thing in different areas, especially as the population grows all over the county.
And we're going to start planting churches in these communities. Rather than expecting them to come to us, we're going to train our people to go to their communities. And we're going to put people that we've raised up here into those places to plant churches.
And it goes back to what God cares about and the miracle of Real Life Ministries and why there is a miracle of Real Life Ministries, and it's about personal discipleship. And we didn't realize it at the time. It wasn't anybody's fault, but we got steered into, we're gonna build this large property out there and it's gonna be fantastic. And the property itself, the things that we were gonna do on there, like other churches around America, it was gonna be attractional like Disneyland, and people were gonna show up because of the property. And all that does is make more people in seats that are spectators. We didn't realize that that's not our model. And in fact, that model would fly in the way of what our vision is and what God created Real Life Ministries for.
The story of Real Life Ministries is God was working both in positive things and even some hard things that slowed us down at the time seemed to be a negative, actually turned out to be a positive. God was directing our steps, and we just learned to trust Him. And when things were good, we went through the doors. And if it didn't seem good at the time, if we're just pressing into Him and walking into Him with Him, He can even turn those things into a change of direction that still brings glory to God. So we're just really grateful that we get to talk about the hero of this story, and it's Jesus.